Hey guys, tonight we'll journey back in time to explore a story that is both romantic and tragic. Maybe you're lying in bed, your phone screen dimmed, or you're simply looking for a quiet story to keep you company. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please share in the comments where you are and what the local time is. It's wonderful to know that these stories are connecting us from different time zones. Our main character tonight is a woman with deep, soulful eyes, an intellect sharp enough to challenge the greatest minds, and an ambition so fierce it could reshape the very religious foundation of a nation. That's Anne Boleyn. Her story isn't just about love and betrayal. It's the tale of a woman who refused to be a mistress, inadvertently sparking a religious revolution, shattering a 1,000-year relationship between England and Rome, and ultimately paying for it with everything she had, including her life. You might know her as the second wife of Henry VIII, who was executed. But what many don't realise is that without Anne Boleyn, there would be no Church of England, no Elizabeth I, and English history would have taken a completely different turn. This woman truly changed the course of Western civilization, and then paid the ultimate price for it. In the next few minutes, I'll take you through the most dramatic rise and fall in royal history. We'll explore how a girl from a minor noble family managed to captivate the most powerful monarch in Europe, how she survived court intrigue, and how she ultimately became a victim of the very forces she helped unleash. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself nestled in the soft hush of night, eyes growing heavy as you drift into a world of gentle whispers and drifting thoughts. Tonight, our story begins 1,507 years into the second millennium, when a child named Anne Boleyn entered the world. Born to a modest branch of the English aristocracy, she was neither destined for a life of obscurity nor content to accept the simple accomplishments of most young ladies at court. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, served as a crafty courtier under King Henry VII, and her mother, Lady Elizabeth Boleyn née Howard, descended from the eminent Howard family. Anne was the second of 3 siblings, an elder sister Mary, and a younger brother George, who would all play parts in the unfolding drama. Anne's early years offered a glimpse of her unquenchable curiosity. While other girls of her station devoted themselves to the quiet refinement of embroidery or the soft grace of curtsying, Anne's father made a bold decision. He sent her abroad for an education that would reshape her destiny. At the tender age of 13, she journeyed to the court of Margaret of Austria in the Low Countries. There, amid the elegant canals and hushed corridors of Margaret's palace, Anne mastered French, the language of diplomacy, and absorbed the subtleties of courtly etiquette. It was in those quiet lessons, learning to address dukes and duchesses, negotiating the delicate politics of ceremonial presentation, that she discovered her greatest strength, a sharp mind capable of swaying opinion and commanding respect. When the winds of ambition carried her onward, Anne ventured to the glittering courts of France. The French court, in all its splendour, resembled a grand tournament where wit and intelligence shone brighter than any jewelled tiara. She learned to dance with a lightness that made lords pause in admiration, to converse with scholars on matters of theology and statecraft, and to attire herself in fashions that balanced elegance with a subtle hint of defiance. In those hallowed halls, where beauty and brains interwove like the finest brocade, Anne honed her ability to engage learned abbots in theological debate, and to captivate poets with her elegant presence. She returned to England, not as the timid girl who had departed, but as a woman confident in every step, every glance, every measured word. Upon her arrival in England in the year 1521, the court reacted with astonishment. Anne's long, dark hair framed a flawless, pale complexion, and her deep brown eyes shone with the secret knowledge of continental intrigues. English nobles, accustomed to pale, timid debutantes, now encountered a figure who spoke Latin with ease, who could recite passages from Erasmus, and who might outdance any lady of the court. She listened attentively as bishops discussed ecclesiastical reform, and she gently challenged ambassadors over matters of foreign policy. It was this uncommon combination of beauty, learning, and boldness that caught the eye of King Henry VIII, a monarch already weary of the familiar faces that circulated his court. Henry, weary of a marriage that produced no male heir, found in Anne not merely a new fascination, but a spark that ignited his royal desires. Their introduction began a courtship unlike any other. Anne, remembering lessons in self-possession, refused his early advances, asserting that she would never become merely his mistress. Her refusal, firm yet courteous, only intensified the king's resolve. Night after night, he penned letters craving her favour. Day after day, he marshalled theologians and lawyers to seek grounds for annulling his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. And amidst these grand political manoeuvres, Anne maintained her composure, her quiet dignity, a testament to her upbringing in two of Europe's most exacting courts. By the time the year 1533 arrived, Henry and Anne had consummated their union in a secret ceremony. She was crowned queen in June of that same year, the first queen consort England had ever known who had insisted upon marriage rather than the king's casual affection. Yet even as Anne sat upon the coronation chair, her mind remained as alert as any scholar's, contemplating the Protestant ideas stirring in Wittenberg, considering how a queen might wield spiritual influence, and pondering the delicate balance of power now resting in her hands. So, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world beyond your window blurs into twilight, reflect upon this remarkable woman. Anne Boleyn, daughter of Sir Thomas and Lady Elizabeth, sister of Mary and George, alumna of Margaret of Austria's court and the French royal household, entered this world quietly, but left her mark upon the very foundations of the English realm. Having captured King Henry's attention with her unmatched wit and poise upon her return to England, Anne Boleyn soon found herself at the heart of a pursuit unlike any other the court had ever seen. Henry VIII, long wearied by his formal marriage to Catherine of Aragon, who, after nearly 2 decades together, still could not provide him with a male heir, had grown bored of the customary liaisons that passed through his chambers. In those earlier years, the ladies of his court, accustomed to a monarch's fleeting favours, would readily bend to his will, receiving sumptuous gifts of jewels and estates, offering themselves in whispered twilight encounters, and then quietly withdrawing once the king's interest waned. Yet when Henry first laid eyes on Anne in the year 1526, everything changed. Anne was no ordinary court beauty. Instead of yielding her heart and body as so many before her had done, she surprised Henry by issuing a polite but firm refusal to become his mistress. This simple refusal carried an unmistakable undercurrent of challenge. Henry, tall, strong, and accustomed to absolute obedience, found his power defied for the first time. His nights grew restless as he lay awake, replaying the memory of Anne's dark eyes and the gentle firmness of her no. Such a rebuff was unthinkable for a monarch so used to commanding adoration. Recognizing the power of her position, Anne adopted a strategy of deliberate intrigue, a cat-and-mouse dance that ensnared the king's heart. At times she greeted him with laughter and warmth, her presence as luminous as candlelight upon gilded walls. On other occasions she was reserved and distant, leaving courtiers to whisper in hushed speculation. She accepted his lavish gifts, a string of lustrous pearls, a ruby ring of exquisite cut, but never allowed them to bind her promise. Instead she signalled, through a raised brow or a carefully chosen phrase, that these tokens did not obligate her to any vow. Anne did more than toy with Henry's affections. She engaged him on matters of theology, probing his thoughts on whether monarchs might interpret Holy Writ according to their own conscience, how princes should balance divine law with royal decree, and to what extent a sovereign might challenge the supremacy of Rome. Such discussions, conducted in the quiet intimacy of private chambers, both flattered and flustered the king, his intellect stimulated by her sharp mind, yet unsettled by her willingness to confront him on sacred matters. Then, at moments when Henry's yearning peaked, Anne vanished from court. She would disappear for weeks, retreating to her family's estates or undertaking ostensibly trivial journeys, leaving Henry to dispatch envoys in anxious pursuit. The king's frustration mounted. No royal command could compel her presence. He found himself composing desperate letters by candlelight, each line more pleading than the last. "If you but grant me your favour, I shall forsake all others and give myself entirely to you." These letters, once unimaginable upon the hand of a monarch, flowed from Henry in a torrent of longing. It was a profound reversal of roles. Henry, sovereign of England and defender of the faith, now stood as suitor before a woman who refused to yield. His courtiers watched with astonishment as the most powerful man in Christendom became ensnared by Anne's careful balance of allure and restraint. This courtship, unlike any other, revealed that even royal authority could falter when met by genuine resolve. Yet Anne's refusal was not born of cruelty. She understood that to surrender herself completely would extinguish the very desire that had captured Henry's devotion. Instead, she maintained just enough reserve to keep him entranced, encouraging him with moments of grace, but never granting the immediate conquest he sought. In doing so, she secured her place not as a mere mistress, but as an equal in a delicate game of power and persuasion. As the months passed, the whispers in Westminster grew louder. Could a king dissolve his long-standing marriage, defy the Pope, and declare Anne his queen? While prelates fretted over the theological implications and foreign ambassadors murmured of political upheaval, Anne moved through court with serene composure. She noted promotions quietly granted to her family, signs of her growing influence, and she listened intently when bishops expressed concern about the king's obsession. Yet she revealed no hint of panic or doubt. And so, in the hush of candlelit hallways, the most dramatic courtship in English history played out. A monarch, accustomed to unquestioned power, transformed into a humble petitioner, and a woman of ambition and intellect who held the reins of his desire. As you drift towards slumber, imagine the soft rustle of silk gowns, the muted glow of torchlight on polished stones, and the whispered names of Anne and Henry echoing through the silent corridors of power where a single word, no, reshaped the destiny of a kingdom. And so, as Henry waited in restless anticipation, Anne Boleyn revealed that her demands extended far beyond the private games of affection and intrigue she had so carefully orchestrated. Anne did not merely wish to be his mistress. She insisted upon becoming his wife. More than that, she demanded that he annul his marriage of 15 years to Catherine of Aragon, an act that pointed a direct dagger at the heart of the Roman Curia. In doing so, she asked him to abandon the quiet protocol of royal lovers and embrace the full, irrevocable commitment of queen consort. Such a request carried with it the weight of sacrilege. To make Anne his wife was necessarily to dismantle the very bonds of religious authority that had long bound England to Rome. Henry, however, was neither deterred nor embarrassed. From his court at Greenwich to the universities of Paris, he summoned theologians and legal scholars to fashion arguments in support of his desired annulment. He dispatched envoys to the papal court in Rome, bearing written pleas and meticulously crafted briefs. He assembled a council of canon lawyers in England, framing his case around a single, audacious argument that his union with Catherine had been invalid from the start, owing to her previous role as the widow of his brother. Yet Catherine's retinue, supported by the powerful House of Aragon, fiercely defended her position. Courtiers and clergy called Anne a usurper and a home-wrecker, accusing her of toppling the rightful queen and undermining the stability of the kingdom. Within the English nobility, many voices raised objections to Anne's humble origins. Although her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, had ascended to the title of Earl of Wiltshire and her brother George had become a confidant of the king, the Boleyns still lacked the centuries-old pedigree of the most established houses. Traditionalists claimed it unseemly that a lady of comparatively modest lineage should displace a princess of Spain. Whispers circulated that Anne's ambition was unseemly, that she sought to overturn not merely a marriage but the divine order itself. Yet Anne's star continued to rise. She drew close to reform-minded churchmen, most notably Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, who saw in Henry's quest the chance to sever English dependence on Rome and reshape ecclesiastical authority under the crown. Cranmer, a learned scholar with connections at Cambridge, wrote treatises arguing that no earthly power could bind a king's conscience if it contravened the dictates of Scripture. Cromwell, ever the shrewd administrator, organised the legal machinery in Westminster and prepared royal proclamations to assert the king's supremacy. In quiet council chambers and dimly lit studies, they devised the framework for an English church that answered to no pontiff but the sovereign of England. As the papal court in Rome dug in its heels, refusing to grant the annulment, Anne recognised that a further step was required. The king's personal grievance was now a national crisis, and the Boleyn cause had become the catalyst for a profound religious schism. If the Pope would not yield, then England must. The notion took root in Anne's mind that her marriage could inaugurate a new era, one in which the king himself would stand as head of the English Church, free from foreign interference. Such a break would shift the divine right of kings into a new light. Rather than acknowledging a higher spiritual authority, the monarch would embody both temporal and ecclesiastical power. This vision transcended Anne's personal ambitions. It spoke to a deeper transformation, one that would reforge the relationship between throne and altar. Where once the Pope in Rome held sway over the spiritual welfare of English subjects, now the English crown would claim that role outright. Monasteries and convents, wealthy repositories of land and treasure, would fall under royal jurisdiction. Bishops would be appointed by the king instead of by distant prelates. And above all, the English people would pledge their loyalty to a church whose authority derived not from a foreign city but from the same crown that governed their daily lives. In royal audiences and hushed confidences, Anne pressed this argument with calm eloquence. She spoke of a church purified, liberated from the politics of Rome, a church responsive to the needs of English souls. She described a realm where religious devotion might flourish unimpeded by the intrigues of distant courts. And she reminded the king of his duty to secure the succession, to ensure that the Tudor line would continue unchallenged, both in bloodline and in spiritual unity. Thus, as summer waned and autumn's chill crept across the court, Henry and Anne stood at the threshold of unprecedented change. The demand for annulment had ignited a firestorm that reached from Westminster to Rome, from Oxford to Wittenberg. Anne's insistence upon marriage and the king's willingness to sanction a break with the papacy would soon reshape the very foundations of English faith and governance. And in the quiet of candlelit corridors, one could sense the tremor of history about to pass through the realm, carrying Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII into a new age of sovereign power. Now, dear listener, allow these gentle revelations of resolve and reform to drift through your mind like a soft breeze. As you surrender to slumber, imagine the quiet resolve in Anne's eyes, the determined hand of Henry on his quill, and the hush of candlelight flickering across parchment. Rest, knowing that their daring would echo through the centuries, stirring even the deepest dreams with the promise of transformation. And so, in the hush that followed their bold maneuvers, Henry and Anne conducted their secret wedding beneath the low vault of a small private chapel, sometime between the waning days of 1532 and the first frost of 1533. Only a handful of witnesses, a discreet bishop, a loyal courtier, and the chapel's gentle sacristan, stood in the dim flicker of candlelight as Anne, after 6 long years of courtly struggle, at last took her place as queen. The very air seemed to suspend itself in reverent silence, as though the walls of ancient stone held their breath to witness this turning of the page. Henry, who had known unquestioned obedience throughout his realm, now knelt in quiet solemnity to slip the wedding ring upon the hand of the woman who had dared to defy him. Word of the nuptials spread like a tremor through the tapestry of European courts. In Rome, the Pope's anger roared through candlelit halls as papal legates condemned this breach of sacred order. He excommunicated the king's loyalists, who had aided in the clandestine ceremony, and threatened to lay England under interdict. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Emperor, ever watchful for his aunt's vindication, massed troops along the northern borders of Italy, and looked to threaten war if Catherine's rights were not restored. Back in England, Catherine's faction, poised and proud in their devotion, cried betrayal, labelling Anne an interloper who had usurped a princess by virtue of her Spanish blood. They rallied conservative peers and bishops to denounce the union as null and void, insisting it would bring nothing but scandal to the realm. Yet Anne stood tall amid these storm-tossed currents. She carried within her the promise of new life, and word soon arrived that she was with child, a single word that soared above the clamour like a hymn of hope. Henry, long haunted by the absence of a male heir, now imagined his line secured, the Tudor legacy assured by the Queen's womb. Court masques and banquets, once pallid with nerves, glowed anew with festive colours as nobles toasted the future prince who would unite the crown and throne. Anne, though beset by worry and the first pangs of pregnancy, carried herself with serene dignity. Each step forward seemed to echo with destiny. When the child was born, however, the world shifted once more on its axis. Instead of the anticipated son, a daughter arrived in the early hours of September the 7th, 1533, delicate and rosy with her mother's dark eyes. The birth of Princess Elizabeth brought a hush over the court's jubilation as hope gave way to uncertainty. Henry, who had imagined the clash of cymbals to herald a prince, pressed his lips into a thin line and bowed his head over the swaddled infant. Even the king's regal composure flickered with disappointment. Yet Anne, ever mindful of her precarious station, offered a gentle smile as she cradled her child, whispering blessings that seemed to light the dim corridors with promise. That moment, despite its undercurrents of regret, marked the apex of Anne's triumph and the nadir of her danger. For in claiming the crown and bearing the king's child, she stood exposed to all the forces of tradition and dissent. Conservative lords whispered that the Queen's foreign education had corrupted her fidelity. They spoke of omens and portents, of the king's moral peril. Catherine's allies still insisted on her legitimacy, and Catholic emissaries wrote secret letters promising papal vengeance. English commoners, ever wary of change, remarked that the older Queen remained wronged, and that Anne's ascendancy threatened the very bedrock of the nation's devotions. Nevertheless, Anne's days were no longer filled with pleading entreaties or anxious flights of fancy. She moved through the corridors of power with measured grace, entwining ceremonial duties with the private strength of a mother determined to protect her child. She listened to her husband's counsel on state matters, discussed funding for new grammar schools, and patronized scholars eager to translate the scriptures into the vernacular. In the privacy of their chambers, Henry's ardor returned in waves of tenderness as he gazed upon Anne's calm courage and the fragile blossom of their daughter's well-being. Yet every smile was tinged with the shadow of what might be lost. The court celebrations carried an undercurrent of unease, for the Queen's position had never been more visible and thus more vulnerable. Anne would rise each morning to the sound of trumpets heralding Elizabeth's name, yet her nights were haunted by the distant howls of dissent. She kept close to her side the handful of reformers who believed in the new Church of England, nurturing conversations that edged forward with theological boldness. She asked nothing more than the right to be recognised as Henry's lawful wife and Elizabeth's proud mother. Yet church bells in every parish told with conflicting messages about loyalty and orthodoxy. In those months after Elizabeth's birth, Anne Boleyn reigned at the very crest of her fortunes and the very brink of her trials. Each act, each public appearance, carried the gravity of history in motion. And so, dear listener, as you drift into sleep, imagine the hush of royal chambers made luminous by candlelight, the gentle echo of Anne's footsteps upon polished stone, and the soft cooing of a newborn princess cradled in her mother's arms. And so, after their secret nuptials and the birth of a child who would one day rule, Anne Boleyn found herself crowned Queen of England. Yet her elevation, which might have seemed to secure her future, instead ushered in a season of mounting tension at court. The political maelstrom that had raged in hidden chambers now burst into public view. Factions loyal to Catherine of Aragon seethed with indignation, denouncing Anne as an interloper who had supplanted a Spanish princess and dethroned legitimate authority. Traditionalists among the clergy and nobility bristled at the notion that their sovereign had dared to sever ties with Rome, a relationship handed down through a millennium of custom. And among the common people, tongues were divided between those who hailed the new queen as the architect of England's independent destiny and those who mourned the older, more familiar order. On the 1st of June in the year 1533, Anne's coronation was staged with unparalleled extravagance. From the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey, the streets were lined with banners of cloth of gold and attendants clad in robes threaded with silver and pearls. A solemn procession wound its way past cheering crowds, trumpets blaring and drums rolling, as the new queen, resplendent in crimson velvet and crowned with a diadem of glittering gemstones, made her way to the high altar. Yet beneath the pageantry lay a note of disquiet. Many in the throng refused to remove their hats as she passed, a gesture of deliberate disrespect that spoke volumes about the ambivalence of the realm. Anne, for her part, wore a mask of regal composure, but those who observed her closely noted the furtive glances she cast toward her belly, where the promise of a royal son flickered like a fragile flame. For Anne, every element of that day carried double meaning. Her attire, carefully chosen in tones of emerging gold and green, signified new life and renewal, but to conservative eyes, such showiness seemed a flaunting of sacrosanct restraint. Each word she uttered in the liturgy, each vow she swore before archbishop and prelate, was passed for political overtones. Was this a blessing upon a sovereign nation, now free of papal overlords, or an affront to those who saw the Church of Rome as the true inheritor of divine authority? In the height of jubilation, a murmur surged among the onlookers. If Henry's long-awaited prince did not arrive soon, would Anne's radiance fade, and with it her claim to the throne? The Queen's own heart trembled with that shared uncertainty. She had become the very symbol of England's spiritual revolution, and she alone carried the weight of its success. While courtiers bowed and offered compliments, she quietly sought out her husband's gaze, aiming to bolster his resolve. Henry, for his part, stood tall and unyielding at her side, yet his eyes betrayed the familiar anxiety of a man who had gambled his kingdom on the promise of a male heir. When September arrived, the court held its collective breath. The Queen went into labour in the hush of a gilded chamber, attended by midwives and gentlewomen chosen for their discretion. In the early hours of a cool autumn morning, she welcomed her child, a daughter, small and strong, with her mother's dark eyes and a tuft of black hair crowning her head. They named her Elizabeth, in honour of Henry's mother, but the name brought little comfort to the king. He had dreamed of a son, an heir who would secure the Tudor line, and vindicate the sweeping changes that had been set in motion by Anne's refusal to settle for anything less than queenship. The news of Elizabeth's birth spread swiftly, dampening the festive glow that had recently illuminated the court. Henry's tight-lipped congratulations gave way to a sombre countenance, and courtiers whispered that his hopes had been dashed once again. Anne, though outwardly gracious in her acknowledgement of her daughter, felt the fragile plank of her security shift beneath her feet. Where once the populace had rallied behind her banner, now some murmured that without a prince, her tenure would be short-lived. Conservative peers quietly plotted, emboldened by the Queen's perceived failure to deliver the defining male successor. Amid this atmosphere of anxious anticipation, Anne pressed on with her duties, leading daily audiences, sponsoring charitable works, and overseeing preparations for Elizabeth's baptism. Yet the shadow of doubt grew longer with each passing day. Every public appearance risked fresh displays of disrespect, and even the king's private consolations could not fully assuage her fears. She clung to the hope that another pregnancy might yet produce a son. But the months that followed offered only silence where a royal drumroll once seemed certain. Thus, as autumn turned to winter, Anne Boleyn stood at the pinnacle of her power and the cusp of her greatest peril. Her brilliance had ushered in unprecedented religious reform, but without a male heir, her reign now teetered on the brink of collapse. And so, dear listener, as you drift into sleep, imagine the gloom of palace corridors on a cold night, the flicker of torchlight on Anne's worried visage, and the soft cry of a newborn princess echoing through the hush. In the wake of Elizabeth's birth, a daughter, rather than the long-yearned for son Anne Boleyn, found herself engaged in a delicate power struggle with the very court that once rallied to her side. Though King Henry still regarded her with affection, the magnetism that had drawn him so fiercely during their courtship gradually waned as the dream of a male heir slipped through their fingers. Rumours rippled through the corridors of Greenwich and Westminster alike. Conservative lords and the loyalists of Catherine of Aragon met in shadowed galleries, quietly denouncing Anne's bold challenge to age-old traditions. Whispers of unchaste intrigues and even witchcraft charms circulated among them, accusing the Queen of using enchantments to ensnare the king's heart. Amid these growing undercurrents of discontent, Anne endeavoured to shore up her position by strengthening alliances with reformist churchmen. She maintained regular, discreet correspondence with Thomas Cranmer, whose sympathetic scholarship on royal supremacy had already laid the groundwork for ecclesiastical independence. She also conferred with Thomas Cromwell, the king's shrewd secretary, who orchestrated the legal and administrative mechanisms that buttressed the new Church of England. In private chambers, they discussed visions of a national church under the crown's protection, an institution in which Anne herself would stand as a living emblem of reform. Meanwhile, Anne devoted herself to Elizabeth's early upbringing, determined that her daughter should serve as the personification of England's new religious identity. The little princess, swaddled in white linen and carried in gentle arms, became the focal point of Anne's hopes. Every public appearance, every lullaby sung at the palace nursery, was intended to imbue Elizabeth with the virtues of a daughter born into sovereignty. Anne imagined that one day, if a son should come to brighten her future, Elizabeth's presence would stand testament to the Queen's legitimacy and to the permanence of the Church of England. Yet as Anne laboured to knit her alliances tight and shape her daughter's destiny, Henry's attentions drifted away from her troubled side. Across the glittering banqueting hall and through the hush of the royal tent, his gaze grew drawn to another lady of the court, Jane Seymour. In stark contrast to Anne's vibrant intelligence and continental refinement, Jane presented herself as demure, modest, and unassuming qualities that reminded Henry of the stability he had once known. She laughed softly rather than sparking the king's lively debate, and she spoke little, but listened attentively when he spoke. In these shifting tides of favour, Anne felt the subtle chill of her waning influence. The same courtiers who once vied for her smiles now edged closer to Jane's quiet grace, hoping for favours and offices from the king's next confidant. Anne watched with a steady composure, although in her private moments she could scarcely contain the tremor of uncertainty. She continued to attend to Elizabeth, adjusting the tiny garments embroidered with Tudor emblems, and she upheld her public duties, granting audiences, sponsoring charitable foundations, and overseeing the education of the princess. But every step she took was shadowed by the possibility that a new queen consort might soon displace her. Rumours of Anne's supposed indiscretions with courtiers, stories of secret assignations whispered behind tapestry folds, were repeated with relish by those who found her a convenient target. They spoke of midnight rendezvous and forbidden potions, as if Anne's daring ascent had been fueled by sorcery rather than her own indomitable will. Conservative prelates warned the king that to abandon the traditional protocols of courtship was folly, that to supplant Catherine's rightful memory with Anne's defiance would sow discord among the faithful. Yet Henry, whose heart had once raced at Anne's refusal, now seemed to prize the quiet comfort that Jane's gentle presence offered. Despite these personal trials, Anne remained resolute in her purpose. She convened discreet gatherings of sympathetic peers to affirm the new church's doctrines, and she hosted learned theologians who translated scriptural texts into English for the common tongue. She ensured that Elizabeth's latest christening gown was crafted by the finest seamstresses, emblazoned with symbols of the Reformed faith, so that even the infant princess might embody the dawn of a sovereign church. Anne understood that her daughter's very existence represented the future of her reforms, and that every glance Elizabeth received from noble and commoner alike lent weight to the Queen's cause. Meanwhile, Henry's pursuit of Jane grew increasingly open. He sought out her company at hunting parties and favoured her voice in the gallery where musicians played. The contrast between Jane's unobtrusive devotion and Anne's assertive intellect became more pronounced with each passing week. Anne, accustomed to commanding the court's attention, now found herself sharing it with a rival whose virtues seemed tailored to the king's present desires. Thus, as autumn turned to early winter in 1533, Anne Boleyn navigated a court rife with intrigue and opinion. She balanced the tenderness she felt for Elizabeth with the necessity of political manoeuvring, and she maintained her alliances with reformers who eyed her as both partner and talisman of change. Yet she also felt the encroaching chill of Henry's shifting affections, an omen that the crown she wore might yet slip from her brow. And so, dear listener, as your eyelids grow heavy, imagine Anne's quiet resolve, a woman of fierce conviction, cradling her daughter's future in one arm while extending the other to guide the very soul of a nation. And so, as autumn yielded to the chill of winter in the year 1533, Anne Boleyn found herself once again holding hope in her arms, and then losing it. The news arrived in the hush of a royal chamber. Anne was with child for a second time. For a moment, the corridors of Hampton Court echoed with cautious optimism. Henry VIII, who had pressed his ear close to her belly to hear the steady drum of life, dared to dream again of the long-awaited son. But in the early days of 1535, tragedy struck. Anne suffered a miscarriage, the fruit of her womb lost as suddenly and silently as a candle's flame extinguished by a breath of wind. The king's reaction was swift and severe. His sorrow, once tempered by tenderness, now sharpened into anger. He saw in this second loss not mere misfortune, but a sign of ill omen, as if the realm itself recoiled from the thought of Anne's descendants. Rumours spread that she was barren in spirit, that her body betrayed the hopes pinned upon it. Courtiers whispered that the Queen had become a jinx upon the Tudor line, that each failed pregnancy deepened the peril threatening his dynastic ambitions. Where once Henry had courted Anne with ardent devotion, he now turned his frustration into recrimination, accusing her of disrupting the natural order that should have bound them together in conjugal harmony. In the weeks that followed, the palace air grew taut with tension. A marriage once sustained by the twin pillars of love and politics now creaked and groaned, as though each disappointment rent the fabric that held king and queen alike. Anne, stung by the injustice of his blame, responded with fierce indignation. Their private quarrels, once hidden behind closed doors, spilled into the antechambers and council rooms. Courtiers paused in their duties to catch fragments of raised voices, sharp words, and the unmistakable sound of two proud wills clashing in anger. Henry's ire transformed the woman he had once entwined his destiny with into a figure of discomfort, no longer the captivating stranger who dared to elude him, but a burdensome presence who reminded him of his failures. This shift in the king's temperament did not go unnoticed by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and erstwhile ally of the Boleyn cause. Cromwell, who had once marshalled the legal and administrative power to secure Anne's marriage, now gazed upon her with suspicion. He saw in Anne's volatile relationship with the king a potential threat to the grand reforms they had engineered together, an unpredictable queen whose capricious fortunes might unravel the very ecclesiastical foundations of the realm. Quietly, he met with fellow councillors, laying the groundwork for a new strategy, one that would distance the reformist front from Anne's personal controversies and preserve the gains of the Reformation should she fall from favour. Emboldened by Cromwell's doubts, the court's conservative faction seized upon every misstep. Whispers grew louder of indiscretions with foreign envoys and scandalous assignations in hidden corridor alcoves. The most sensational allegations spoke of an incestuous liaison between Anne and her brother George, charges so lurid that even the most credulous paused in disbelief. Yet these tales, however outlandish, spread like wildfire through the Tudor court, fanned by the very atmosphere of mistrust that Henry's anger had kindled. In council chambers and at the banquet table, men and women murmured of Anne's betrayal not only of her marriage vows, but of the nation itself. They spoke of treasonous plots to manipulate the king's authority, of secret correspondence with continental reformers who undermined both papal and parliamentary power. Cromwell, weighing each rumour, recognised their utility. They offered a legal fig leaf for removing a queen now deemed dispensable. Underneath the pretence of concern for the realm's stability, a darker ambition took shape to replace Anne with a consort whose obedience would match the Reformed Church's needs. But Anne, ever conscious of the stakes, did not retreat into fearful silence. She used her few remaining hours of favour to assert her dignity. In public audiences, she greeted petitioner and pilgrim alike, granting mercy and charity on behalf of her daughter's crown. She penned gentle letters to sympathetic bishops, reminding them of her service to the realm and her devotion to the new church's cause. At night, she walked the corridors of her apartments, pausing at the rail to gaze at the moonlit gardens, steeling herself for the trials that rose like shadows around her. Meanwhile, Henry's court moved inexorably toward its next chapter. Jane Seymour's pale calm grew ever more prominent, offered as a contrast to Anne's embattled presence. Cromwell's machinations continued behind closed doors, drafting charges of adultery, treason, and perhaps even witchcraft, to justify what must soon come. And Anne, caught between the wrath of the king and the whispering shadows of the courtyard, felt the ground shift beneath her, even as she struggled to remain queen. And so, in the chill of an April morning in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn's world crumbled like a weary castle under siege. Without warning, royal guards arrived at her chambers in the Tower of London, their faces impassive as they bound her wrists and escorted her away. She was thrust into a small, dim cell of cold grey stone, where the damp draughts whispered of isolation and dread. In adjoining cells sat Mark Smeaton, the court musician whose poetry once made Anne smile; Henry Norris, the gallant gentleman of the Privy Chamber; William Breton, a loyal counsellor; Francis Weston, a young courtier of fine wit; and, heartbreakingly, her own brother, George Boleyn. Each stood accused by tortured confessions or whispered rumour of adultery, treason, even incest with their queen. Imagine Anne's heart as she settled upon the hard flagstone floor, attempting, in the dark hush, to steady her breath. The very stones seemed to press in, cold and silent, as if the tower itself mourned the turn of events. In the empty corridors, the clink of chains and distant footsteps echoed like the relentless ticks of an unseen clock. She recalled the voices that once praised her intelligence, her charm, her grace, and now those same voices unleashed accusations as wild as the autumn wind. She could almost see the faces of former allies turned judges, listening with stiff brows to the royal clerk as he read charges so absurd that their absurdity made her tremble all the same. They said she had betrayed her husband's trust, cavorting with these men in secret rendezvous. They said she had cursed the Tudor line, her pregnancies poisoned by her own wicked sorcery. They levelled the most damning claim of all, that she had consorted carnal secrets with her brother George, a betrayal of blood and crown. In that moment, Anne must have wondered how truth could be rendered meaningless by the machinery of power. Her pain was both private and public. Private in the memory of each tender moment with her daughter Elizabeth, public in the knowledge that her every reaction would be scrutinized and condemned. On the 15th day of May, 1536, daylight streamed weakly through high windows as Anne was brought before a gathering of 26 peers. They sat upon carved benches of dark oak, robes and insignia gleaming in the morning sun. Among them her uncle Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, eyes stern with duty. Anne, stepping into the great hall, must have felt every heartbeat pound like a drum of doom. She greeted them not as enemies, but as noblemen entrusted with the gravest of responsibilities. Yet in their silent glances lay the unspoken truth. The verdict was predetermined. With measured calm, Anne addressed each charge against her. She spoke of her love for Henry, of her loyalty to the crown, of the innocence that lay like a clear spring at the centre of her soul. She dismantled the accusations of adultery with logic that crackled like lightning. How could so many men conspire in secrecy when the Tower stands endlessly under watch? She asked how a queen, clothed in the heavy robes of office and the gaze of thousands, could find opportunity for such illicit meetings. As for the incest charge, she raised her head and met the eyes of each judge, demanding to know by what testimony such a monstrous claim could stand. Her words, delivered with fierce eloquence, silenced the hall in reverent awe. Yet Tudor justice cared not for speeches, nor for the crack in a conscience. The question was not what was true, but what served the king's need. When the clerk called out the unanimous verdict of guilty on all counts, it fell upon Anne like a hammer blow. She bowed her head, her dark hair glimmering against the sunlight, and accepted the lethal sentence with the composure of a queen born to bear both crown and cross. In her final moments at that trial, Anne turned her gaze to Henry's representatives, speaking words that must have cut deeper than any blade. She begged mercy not for herself, but for her young daughter, Elizabeth, whose fate now wavered on the edge of royal whim. "Let not my downfall be Elizabeth's ruin," she implored in a voice as steady as prayer. "I forgive those who have brought this day, and I commend my spirit to God. May my son, if ever I bear one in heaven, live to love his country better than this one has loved me." With that, the trial concluded, leaving no room for appeal. Anne was led away, her silhouette small against the grandeur of the hall, yet nobler in spirit than any coronation could proclaim. The peers returned to their duties, the echo of their own judgments chasing them down cold corridors. And behind the heavy doors of the Tower, Anne Boleyn prepared for the final act of a life intertwined with thrones and dreams. And so, on the morning of May 19th in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn walked with steady resolve toward the scaffold that awaited her. Draped in a simple gown of ash-grey damask, she set one foot before the other, each step measured and calm upon the timber planks. A soft breeze stirred the folds of her skirts as the assembled crowd fell into reverent silence. Anne paused at the top of the steps, inclining her head in a graceful bow to those who watched with bated breath. Her voice, clear yet gentle, proclaimed her innocence. She forgave those who had condemned her, and offered prayers for the soul of her king and husband. In that fleeting moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath. The headsman, summoned from across the channel for his precise skill with the sword, climbed the steps behind her. Anne closed her eyes for a brief instant, gathering her courage as though for a final act of service. Then, with the quiet dignity of a woman who had never bowed to injustice, she laid her head upon the block. There came a single, swift stroke, so precise that it cleaved life from body in an instant, and the crown that she had so ardently borne tumbled to the ground. Her body, once clothed in the splendour of coronation robes and the finery of a queen, was now laid in a simple shroud and hastily interred within the chapel of Street Peter ad Vincula, beneath the very stones she had once walked upon. No majestic funeral procession preceded her burial, nor did the bells toll in mournful lament. Instead, Anne's final resting place was marked by a modest grave, unadorned save for the memory carried in the hearts of those who had witnessed her fate. Yet history, with its unstoppable tide, refused to let her be forgotten. 22 years later, in the year 1558, her daughter Elizabeth ascended the throne as Queen of England. The princess, whose birth had once been hailed with disappointment, now inherited a realm primed for greatness. Over the next 45 years, Elizabeth I would cement the English Church's independence, steer her nation through political tempests, and preside over a cultural renaissance that illuminated the world. The religious legacy that Anne had unwittingly set in motion the Protestant Reformation in England took firm root under Elizabeth's careful hand. The monarch's policies ensured that the crown held supremacy over the Church, a bold shift from centuries of papal authority. Cathedrals and chapels across the land rang with the English tongue, as scripture and prayer were translated for every parishioner's understanding. Under Elizabeth's guidance, the Church of England emerged as a sanctuary for moderate faith, avoiding extremes while affirming the core tenets of Reformed belief. Politically, Anne's dramatic stand against external authority laid early groundwork for a sovereign nation. Elizabeth built upon this foundation, forging alliances that balanced power among European states, and nurturing the growth of a parliamentary system that would one day define modern governance. Military victories, such as the stunning defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, showcased England's rising confidence and naval prowess achievements that might have seemed impossible in decades past. Culturally, the transformation was equally profound. The arts flourished under Elizabeth's patronage. Theatres in London thronged with audiences eager for the plays of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their contemporaries. Poets and painters found encouragement at court, and the English language itself blossomed into a vehicle for complex thought and lyrical expression. These developments echoed Anne's own appreciation for learning and conversation values she had embraced during her sojourns in the courts of Europe. Spiritually, Anne's conviction that a queen could shape a nation's faith laid the path for future female leaders. Her courage in challenging an absolute monarch's expectations foreshadowed the possibilities for women in governance, providing a model, however tragic, of how a woman's will could intersect with the machinery of state. Elizabeth herself, mindful of her mother's fate, navigated her reign with a blend of resolve and restraint, ensuring that the mistakes which had cost Anne her life would not be repeated. In the centuries that followed, Anne Boleyn's story became a beacon for those who dared to question entrenched power. Historians, novelists, and playwrights revisited her life time and again, drawn to the sheer drama of her rise and fall and to the larger truths her experience revealed. That personal conviction can alter the course of history, that love and politics are often bound in tragic seams, and that the legacy of one determined woman can ripple outward in waves of lasting change. Thus, as the memory of her final day fades only to linger again in the turning of each calendar page, Anne Boleyn remains more than a footnote in the annals of monarchy. She stands as testament to the potency of choice, to refuse the constraints of tradition, to demand one's rightful place, and to inspire generations to embrace the uncertain promise of transformation. In that promise lies the gentle whisper that carries us beyond losses and betrayals, guiding us toward a future shaped by the daring hearts of those who walk unbowed. Following that promise of transformation, when Elizabeth I ascended the throne in the year 1558, she carefully observed the lessons of her mother's rise and fall. Anne Boleyn's life had shown the peril of relying solely on personal affection or extreme partisanship. Elizabeth resolved instead to wield her power with thoughtful subtlety. She cultivated alliances with the moderate peers of England, those noble families whose steady loyalty provided a foundation of stability. At the same time, she reconciled reformist clergy, those eager to embrace new Protestant ideas, with the more traditional bishops who feared too much change too quickly. Beyond her own realm, Elizabeth maintained supple and adaptive diplomatic relations with the great powers of Europe, ensuring that England's interests were advanced without alienating potential allies. From her earliest days, Elizabeth benefited from an education that would prepare her for this intricate balancing act. Under the tutelage of the finest scholars, men who had taught at Cambridge and Oxford, she mastered several languages, studying Latin, French, and Italian, until she could converse as fluently as any diplomat. Her mind absorbed theology with equal facility, enabling her to debate the nuances of faith and governance with both reverence and critical insight. But perhaps her greatest skill was the art of diplomacy itself, learning when to speak, when to listen, when to lean forward in counsel, and when to lean back in gracious silence. Once crowned, Elizabeth moved swiftly to establish religious peace. In the year 1559, she issued the Act of Uniformity, sometimes called the Supremacy and Uniformity Act, which created the Church of England in its Protestant form. This new religious settlement married ancient liturgical traditions with the core teachings of the Reformation. English services, conducted in the vernacular, retained familiar ceremonies and vestments that reassured conservative worshippers, while simultaneously embracing Reformed doctrine to satisfy those who had yearned for change. The result was a measured compromise that helped avoid the deep divisions that had scarred so many other nations. Elizabeth's vision extended beyond prayer and pulpit. She recognized that wealth and education were twin pillars of a thriving state. The vast lands and treasures once held by dissolved monasteries were redirected toward building grammar schools and universities, extending learning beyond cathedral schools to towns and villages across the kingdom. At sea, she reinforced the Royal Navy, commissioning new ships and encouraging privateers to guard English trade routes. In ports from London to Bristol, merchants thrived under policies that incentivized commerce and exploration. By bolstering domestic industry and fostering overseas ventures, Elizabeth ensured that England's economy would underpin its political independence. All these efforts coalesced into what historians would later dub the Elizabethan Golden Age. Poets and playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe found fertile ground for their genius. London's stages hum with creative energy, drawing audiences from every walk of life. Raw materials from the New World stirred innovation in shipbuilding and navigation, while merchants returned with spices, silks, and riches that filled the royal coffers. In 1588, when the formidable Spanish Armada sought to invade, it was the strength of England's navy, bolstered by Elizabeth's foresight and the indomitable spirit of her sailors, that shattered the invaders under a storm of cannon fire and tempestuous wind. Through each triumph, Elizabeth's cautious yet confident leadership shone. She neither flaunted her authority in harsh decrees, nor retreated behind the veil of courtly politeness. Instead, she chose the slender path between extremes, listening to petitioners on the palace steps as patiently as she parleyed with foreign ambassadors. She carried the memory of her mother's tragic end in her heart, reminding herself that power must be exercised with both firmness and mercy. In doing so, she transformed England into a beacon of stability, where faith, learning, and enterprise blended in harmonious motion. The legacy of that era, tempered by compromise and kindled by creativity, endures as testament to what measured rule can achieve. England's golden age arose not from the whims of a single ruler's passion, but from the judicious cultivation of alliances, the prudent management of church and state, and the nurturing of minds and ships alike. Elizabeth's reign proved that authority need not crush dissent to succeed, but rather could draw strength from a tapestry of voices, each contributing its own thread to the nation's grand design. As night deepens and your breath slows, let the memory of her careful reign lull you toward rest, reminding you that true power often lies in the gentle art of balance. Building upon the commerce, exploration, and naval victories that defined her reign, Elizabeth I also presided over an extraordinary cultural renaissance that radiated far beyond England's shores. The days when London's dusty yards saw only merchant caravans and cannon drills were eclipsed by the rise of a thriving theatre district. In the span of a single decade, dozens of playhouses sprang up around the city, from the sweltering Globe Theatre on the south bank of the Thames to the Royal's Men's Blackfriars in the city proper. Audiences of all ranks flocked to see the latest works of playwrights who plumbed human comedy and tragedy with equal brilliance. William Shakespeare's dramas echoed in every corner, from Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream to Hamlet and Macbeth, each new production unveiling fresh layers of language and insight. Christopher Marlowe's histories and tragedies, full of ambition and betrayal, poured forth from press and stage, their bold verse matched only by the actors' fervent performances. Elizabeth encouraged these artists, recognizing that the performing arts offered not only entertainment, but a subtle form of diplomacy. Through masks and court entertainments, spectacles combining poetry, music, dance, and sumptuous costumes, she conveyed themes of national unity and the virtues of her reign. Foreign ambassadors invited to these pageants returned to their courts with lavish descriptions of English ingenuity, their reports fueling curiosity and admiration across Europe. This soft power of culture proved as vital to England's stature as any fleet of warships or treaty of alliance. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's policies on printing catalyzed a broader intellectual awakening. Under her patent system, Booksellers and printers received royal charters that balanced censorship with encouragement. Cheap quartos of plays, scientific treatises, and astronomical observations rolled off the presses in rapid succession. Works such as Thomas Diggers's treatises on heliocentrism and John Dee's studies of navigation found eager readers among both scholars and merchants. Scientific texts describing the movements of stars and planets, once the exclusive province of Latin-speaking clerics, appeared in English to guide mariners and curious minds alike. At the same time, education spread beyond the cloistered walls of cathedral schools. Grammar schools, newly endowed by funds redirected from dissolved monasteries, opened in market towns from Canterbury to Carlisle. Boys and girls alike learned to read and write, mastering not only the Lord's Prayer but also the sonnets of Sidney and Spenser. Literacy, once a rare skill, became a more common possession, empowering citizens to engage with political pamphlets and religious debates. The ideal that Anne Boleyn had championed of a church guided by an informed laity now bore fruit in the foundations of a burgeoning scientific revolution. Through poetry, theatre, and the court's musical compositions, a spirit of individual expression blossomed. Lyricists penned verses that explored personal feeling with unprecedented candour. Court composers, inspired by continental masters, blended intricate melodies with English verse to create new genres of consort music. The result was a society in which the individual voice found both public applause and personal fulfillment. Noble patrons supported their favourite writers and musicians, while merchants and craftsmen found pleasure in sharing literary discoveries in coffeehouse discussions and tavern debates. This cultural effervescence was more than mere frivolity. It underscored a profound shift in national self-confidence. From the grand councils of state to humble alehouses, Englishmen and women began to see themselves as part of a civilized, enlightened community. They celebrated the notion that England, though an island kingdom, could rival the arts and learning of Rome, Paris, and Florence. The very walls of London seemed to hum with energy, as fresh plays, verses, and scores emerged weekly, each new work reflecting the ideals of independence and innovation that had defined Elizabeth's rule. The legacy of this golden age, however, finds its roots in the quieter but no less revolutionary choices of Anne Boleyn. By challenging the supremacy of a distant religious authority, Anne set in motion the forces of intellectual freedom. Her insistence that English scripture be read in the vernacular planted the seeds for a society in which questioning and debate replaced unquestioning obedience. Elizabeth's cultural flowering was thus not an isolated phenomenon, but the culmination of a spiritual revolution initiated by her mother's bold stands. Building on this cultural spirit of individual liberty and faith, the ideas of an independent church, communal political rights, and freedom of religion that Anne Boleyn and Elizabeth I had set in motion soon crossed the Atlantic Ocean. English settlers arriving in the New World carried with them not only possessions but also prized copies of the English Bible scripture, rendered in their own tongue alongside the conviction that government should rest upon the consent of the governed. In the year 1607, colonists founded Jamestown on the banks of the James River, seeking new opportunities and religious refuge alike. They endured sweltering heat, insect-borne fevers, and periods of hunger that tested their resolve. Yet even in the depths of hardship, their belief that each man possessed a God-given right to pursue life, liberty, and property sustained them through famine and strife. That foundational principle echoed the earlier shift away from unquestioned royal and papal authority, an echo of Anne's stand for an autonomous church and Elizabeth's harmonious settlement between crown and creed. A dozen years later, in 1620, a group of Puritans sailed aboard the Mayflower to the shores of New England. They came prepared not merely to carve out a living from forests and salt marshes, but to establish a polity reflective of their deepest convictions. On the storm-battered deck, they drafted and signed the Mayflower Compact, a document that bound them to enact just and equal laws for the common good. This compact, the first written framework for self-government in the English colonies, drew directly on the notion that authority derives from the consent of free individuals, a concept born in England's own break with ecclesiastical absolutism. In each new settlement, whether in the swamps of Virginia or the rocky soil of Plymouth, these emigrants placed great stock in the capacities of ordinary men and women. They believed that each person, having the light of God within, should be free to interpret Scripture, to worship without interference, and to speak on matters of community welfare. Such religious equality fostered social cohesion. Ministers guided the conscience of the faithful but did not wield unchallenged power. Town meetings assembled each freeman as an equal participant in local governance. Over time, this practice of direct, participatory democracy became a cornerstone of American identity, an extension of the principle that Anne Boleyn had inaugurated by demanding ecclesiastical independence and that Elizabeth had ratified by forging a national church. These early Americans also believed in economic freedom as an extension of personal autonomy. With land available for cultivation and commerce allowed to flourish without stifling monopolies, they experimented with joint stock companies, tobacco exports, and cod fisheries that brought wealth to remote ports. In Cahokia and Jamestown alike, the doctrine that a man might better his station through enterprise and hard work took root, in contrast to European systems where birth often determined one's fate. Religious tolerance, prized above all, encouraged disparate sects, Pilgrims, Puritans, and later Quakers to settle alongside one another, reducing sectarian strife that had so often plagued the continent. As the 17th century progressed, the English colonies multiplied from New England down to the Chesapeake Bay. In each community, the notion of popular sovereignty, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, gradually transcended its theological origins to become a political truth. Town charters and colonial assemblies convened to levy taxes, enact laws, and oversee justice, all under the watchful eyes of inhabitants who expected accountability from their governors. The distance from London's court magnified the settlers' sense of self-reliance, reinforcing the belief that true authority resided not in distant dukes or popes, but in the collective will of free men and women. By the mid-17th century, the intellectual currents seeded by Anne and Elizabeth had blossomed into a distinctive American outlook. Scholars and civic leaders cited John Locke's writings on natural rights and the social contract, blending Enlightenment thought with the lived experience of New World democracy. Debates in assemblies centered on whether religious tests should bar nonconformists from office, or whether property qualifications should determine voting rights questions that grew out of the same conviction that a just government emerges from the consent and moral agency of its constituents. Thus, the American colonies became test beds for the melding of faith and freedom, for the belief that spiritual and political authority must always answer to the people's conscience. Settlements founded on these ideals would later frame the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution, documents affirming unalienable rights and republican government. The vacuum created by Anne's stand against papal supremacy and Elizabeth's careful balancing act in church governance had widened into a vast canvas upon which colonists painted visions of a new society, one in which freedom of worship, self-government, and economic opportunity formed inseparable pillars. In the hush of pre-dawn light, one might still hear the echoes of Anne Boleyn's courageous refusal and Elizabeth I's prudent reforms carried by the winds over the Atlantic, whispering to those who would build Jamestown and Plymouth. And in that same breeze, the seeds of modern democracy and religious liberty drift on toward future generations, bearing testament to the transformative power of daring to imagine a world where every individual holds sovereignty over self and soul. And now, as our tale drifts gently toward its quiet close, let us slow our pace, soften our voices, and allow the final images to blur like twilight mist slipping over the fields. In the soft hush of memory, we recall Anne's courage in claiming her own destiny, Elizabeth's wisdom in balancing power and compassion, and the generations of dreamers who carried those ideals across stormy seas to forge new societies. Their story reminds us that one person's steadfast conviction can ripple outward to transform the world, that love of truth, tempered by mercy, and tempered further by a willingness to listen, can chart a course through the darkest nights. Picture, if you will, Anne's pale silhouette, the wind whispering through the tower's battlements, melting into the distant past, and Elizabeth's warm smile, a beacon against the gathering clouds of political turmoil, fading into the soft glow of remembrance. See the first hardy settlers, clutching their Bibles and their hopes, stepping onto alien shores, and feel how the ideals of freedom and community, first kindled in the courts of London, took root in sun-baked fields and winter-scarred forests. Beyond the blaze of battle and the fanfare of coronations lies the quieter truth, that every conviction given voice, every conscience allowed to speak, every soul granted a measure of sovereignty, adds a stitch to the vast tapestry of human history. It is in the gentle act of reading a text in one's own language, the measured decision of a gathered town meeting, the courageous refusal to bow to injustice, that the deepest legacy of Anne and Elizabeth endures. And as these final echoes fade, imagine the candle's flame growing ever smaller, its warmth retreating to a single point of glowing peace. The walls of the past dissolve, leaving only the soft cadence of your own breath, in and out, steady and calm. Let the tension of the day slip away, carried off by a breeze you cannot see but can feel upon your skin. Remember the story's heart, the power of self-determination and the promise of a community built upon trust, respect, and shared purpose. Know that, in your own life, you hold the seeds of change, whether through a small act of kindness, a word spoken in defense of truth, or a quiet conviction that justice and compassion may walk hand in hand. Now let your eyelids close, the world beyond your window sinking into gentle darkness. May your dreams be cradled by the courage of those who dared to speak for themselves, and by the wisdom of those who learned to balance strength with grace. Drift softly into the realm of sleep, where tomorrow's possibilities await, fresh and uncharted. Sleep well, dear friend. And if our stories have brought you comfort, do remember to subscribe so that, night after night, you may return to the soft glow of history's whispers and the soothing cadence of tales well told. Good night.